When the billionaire's entourage entered the luxury hospital, the janitor paused his sweeping. The old woman in the wheelchair, elegant, silent, forgotten, caught his eye. Others whispered, "She's deaf, don't bother." But he knelt beside her and signed gently, "Good morning, ma'am. You look beautiful today." Her eyes filled with tears. For the first time in months, she smiled. Her son, busy on the phone, froze. You know sign language?" he asked. The janitor nodded. "My daughter was born deaf. She taught me that silence speaks love too." The billionaire lowered his phone slowly, watching his mother's trembling hands as she reached out to the janitor, touching his cheek like she had found a lost friend in a stranger. The room fell quiet. Nurses who had always seen her as a distant, wealthy patient now saw her eyes glisten with warmth. The janitor smiled humbly and returned to his broom, but the billionaire couldn't shake what he had just witnessed. All his mother's caretakers, doctors, and therapists had failed to make her smile for months. Yet this man, wearing a faded uniform and calloused hands, had reached her heart with a few silent gestures. Later that day, when the billionaire walked past the janitor's closet, he paused and looked inside. The janitor was sitting on a small stool, eating from a simple lunchbox. He looked tired but peaceful. The billionaire asked, "How did you learn to do that?" The janitor smiled faintly. "When you have a daughter who can't hear your voice, you learn to speak differently. At first, I was angry at the world. I wanted her to be normal. But one day, she told me, 'Papa, I can hear you here,' and she touched her chest. That day, I realized love doesn't need sound." That night, the billionaire couldn't sleep. His mother had lost her ability to hear years ago after a stroke, and he had always avoided learning her language. He told himself he was too busy, that his mother understood he loved her even without words. But deep inside, he knew he had failed her. He had built skyscrapers, owned islands, and funded space projects, yet he never learned to say, "I love you," in the only language she could understand. The image of the janitor signing, "You look beautiful today," haunted him. He felt small, ashamed, and for the first time in a long while, lonely. The next morning, he went to the janitor again. "Can you teach me?" he asked quietly. The janitor looked surprised. "Teach you what, sir?" "Sign language," the billionaire replied. The janitor hesitated. "I'm no teacher." "You're the best one I've met," said the billionaire. And so, every evening after work, the billionaire met the janitor in the empty hospital corridor. They sat on an old bench near the vending machine, and the janitor taught him signs: "Mother, love, beautiful, sorry, thank you." The billionaire's movements were awkward at first, his hands stiff, his eyes often wet. "It's not just the hands," the janitor told him once. "It's the heart behind them." Weeks passed, and every time the billionaire visited his mother, he tried to use what he'd learned. At first, she looked confused, then surprised, and finally, proud. She would correct his signs gently, laughing without sound, her eyes sparkling like they once did when he was a child. The hospital staff began to notice how different things felt when he was around. No more cold visits, no more silent tension, just two people finding their way back to each other without words. One afternoon, as the janitor passed by her room, he saw mother and son signing together, their faces glowing with emotion. He quietly turned away, not wanting to interrupt. The billionaire followed him out after the visit and said, "I don't know how to thank you." The janitor smiled. "You already did, by talking to her." Then he walked away, humming softly. A few months later, the janitor stopped coming to work. The billionaire asked around and found out that the man's daughter was very sick and needed an expensive surgery to restore partial hearing. The janitor had been saving every penny but couldn't afford it. Without telling anyone, the billionaire paid for the entire operation anonymously. When the janitor found out, he cried for the first time in years. His daughter's surgery was successful, and the day she heard her father's faint voice for the first time, she whispered, "Papa?" He dropped to his knees, holding her tightly, both of them shaking with joy. The news reached the billionaire's mother, who was now recovering well. She signed to her son, asking if he had anything to do with it. He smiled and nodded. She signed back, "You finally learned what I wanted to teach you all my life. Love is not measured in wealth but in kindness." Tears streamed down his face as he embraced her, realizing that the janitor had not just given his mother happiness but had changed him forever. Years later, when the billionaire's mother passed away peacefully in her sleep, she left behind a letter written in large, shaky handwriting. It said, "To my son, never forget the man who taught you to listen without ears and speak without words." The billionaire found the janitor at the same hospital, still sweeping the floors. He approached him with tears in his eyes and said, "She wanted me to give you something." It was a simple key. Confused, the janitor asked, "What is this?" The billionaire smiled. "A new house, near the ocean, a quiet place where your daughter can hear the waves." The janitor fell to his knees, overcome with emotion. He didn't know how to thank him, but the billionaire shook his head. "No, thank you. You gave me back my mother before I lost her." From that day on, they remained friends. The billionaire often visited the small coastal home, where he would see the janitor and his daughter signing under the sunset, laughing, sometimes in silence, sometimes in sound. And every time he watched them, he remembered that the richest people are not those who own the most, but those who give from the heart. In that quiet understanding between a janitor and a billionaire, between hands that spoke and hearts that listened, a truth was born, that love, in its purest form, doesn't need to be heard, it only needs to be felt. The next day, the billionaire found his mother laughing, truly laughing, as the janitor signed stories beside her bed. The sound was soft and broken, but it was real, filled with life that had been missing for years. He froze at the door, unable to believe his eyes. His mother, once distant and cold from years of silence, now looked radiant, her hands moving gracefully in the air as she responded to the janitor's signs. "She hasn't smiled since Dad died," he whispered, his voice trembling. The janitor simply smiled back, unaware of the miracle he had just created. It wasn't just laughter, it was healing. For the first time, love had found its way back into that sterile hospital room. The billionaire stepped closer, watching quietly as his mother's fingers danced in the air. The janitor's eyes glowed with warmth and respect as he told her a story through signs, a story about his daughter, about how silence had taught him to listen, and how love could be louder than any voice. The old woman's shoulders shook as she laughed silently, her eyes glistening. When the janitor noticed the billionaire standing there, he nodded politely and stood up to leave, but the woman held his hand tightly. Her fragile fingers signed something softly, and the janitor smiled, replying with a simple gesture of peace before quietly walking away. That evening, the billionaire sat beside his mother, tears forming in his eyes. He tried to talk, but his throat tightened. He finally signed a few words that the janitor had taught him. His mother watched, then smiled and corrected his hand movement gently, her eyes full of pride. "I'm learning," he said, his voice breaking. She touched his cheek with a trembling hand and signed, "I know." That small moment felt like forgiveness, like a bridge rebuilt after years of distance. Days turned into weeks, and the janitor kept visiting her room whenever he could. He would clean quietly, then stop for a few minutes to share a joke, a story, or a prayer in sign language. The hospital staff started noticing the change. The old woman, once quiet and withdrawn, now greeted everyone with a wave and a smile. She even started teaching sign language to one of the nurses. The billionaire watched all this silently, humbled and amazed. He realized that all his money, all his power, had never been able to bring his mother this kind of peace. It took a man with nothing, a janitor, to give her everything she needed. Then one morning, the call came. His mother had passed away peacefully in her sleep. When he reached the hospital, she looked calm, her lips curved in a faint smile. The nurse handed him a note written in shaky handwriting with tears in her eyes. It said, "Thank him. He gave me back my voice." The billionaire sank to his knees beside the bed, clutching the note against his heart. He cried not just for his loss, but for all the years he had wasted not truly listening to her. That evening, he asked the hospital staff for the janitor's address. When he reached the small, crumbling building on the edge of the city, he found the janitor sitting outside on an old wooden chair, mending a broom. The billionaire stepped out of his car and walked toward him with tears in his eyes. The janitor stood up immediately, looking confused and nervous. "Sir, is everything all right?" he asked softly. The billionaire took out the note and handed it to him. "My mother wanted you to have this," he said quietly. The janitor unfolded the paper and read the words. His eyes welled up. "She was a kind soul," he whispered. The billionaire nodded, struggling to speak. "You gave her something none of us could. I want to repay you." He pulled out a check from his pocket, a large sum that could change the janitor's life forever. But the janitor shook his head slowly. "I don't need your money, sir," he said, his voice calm but firm. "There's only one thing I ask. My daughter, she was born deaf, and there's a surgery that could help her hear again. I can't afford it. That's all I want." The billionaire stared at him for a long moment, speechless. He thought of how this man had asked for nothing but hope for his child. Without hesitation, he said, "Consider it done." Weeks later, the surgery was arranged at the best hospital in the city. The janitor and his daughter arrived early in the morning, nervous but grateful. The billionaire was already there, waiting. "She'll be all right," he said gently. The janitor tried to speak, but his voice broke as he whispered, "Thank you, sir. You've given her a chance to live in a world she's never heard." The operation took hours, and both men waited in silence. When the doctor finally came out smiling and said, it was a success, the janitor covered his face and wept. A few days later, they gathered in the recovery room. The little girl sat on the bed, bandages around her ears, her eyes wide with curiosity. The billionaire stood beside her father, holding his breath. The doctor leaned down and whispered softly into her ear, testing her response. Her eyes flickered. Then she turned toward her father, who whispered, "My sweet girl, can you hear me?" There was a moment of stillness, and then her lips trembled as she said, "Papa." The janitor fell to his knees, crying uncontrollably. He wrapped his arms around his daughter as she laughed and cried at the same time, hearing his voice for the first time in her life. The billionaire watched, unable to hold back his tears. It was the purest, most beautiful sound he had ever heard. The janitor looked up at him through tears and said, "You gave her what I couldn't." "Thank you." But the billionaire shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "You gave my mother her smile back. You taught me what love truly means." From that day on, the billionaire became a part of their lives. He funded a small school for deaf children in the janitor's community, naming it the House of Silent Smiles, in honor of his mother. Every year, on the anniversary of her passing, he would visit the school to see the children learning sign language, laughing, and playing, their hands speaking the language of love that needed no sound. As for the janitor and his daughter, they lived a peaceful life filled with gratitude and joy. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the little girl would sit by the window and listen to the sound of the wind, something she once could only imagine. Her father would sign to her, "Do you hear that?" and she would nod, smiling. The billionaire would often visit them, sitting quietly beside them, content in the knowledge that some connections in life are born not from wealth, but from kindness. In the end, two men from opposite worlds, one rich in money, the other rich in heart, found redemption through the same woman who taught them both that love doesn't need to be heard to be felt. Sometimes, the loudest message in life comes from the quietest voice.